Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Thursday, the 22nd of August in London. I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, exclusive reporting finds some banks got crucial US jobs data first after the report's publication was delayed. Tim Walz delivers a pep talk for enthusiastic Democrats as he accepts the party's nomination for vice president. And we have a special report on the shadow fleet of tankers ferrying Russia's oil through the Baltic as concerns grow over ships dubbed piles of junk. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. Crucial US jobs data was released to some banks half an hour before the official publication yesterday. The incident has added to questions over the procedures for releasing some of the world's most sensitive economic information. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
The Bureau of Labour Statistics was due to post the highly anticipated revised payrolls data at 10 a.m. New York time. But while many on Wall Street were left refreshing the webpage for another 30 minutes, Bloomberg has learned that at least three banks, Mizuho, BNP Paribas and Nomura, were able to get the numbers from the government agency by phone. When the data was finally released, it showed the steepest markdown since 2009, sparking a rally in stocks and bonds. The incident has sparked outrage among some market participants and comes after another mishap in May when the BLS inadvertently published inflation data 30 minutes early. In response, the agency told Bloomberg that it was reviewing its procedures. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
Minutes of the latest Federal Reserve meeting show several officials saw a case for a rate cut in July. The vast majority viewed a September reduction as more appropriate, demonstrated by the unanimous vote to keep borrowing costs steady at the last meeting. But some policymakers observed that inflation progress and unemployment increases provided a plausible case for a 25 basis point move last month. Bloomberg's economics editor Michael McKee says there's still some divergence among officials.
You've got some people who were suggesting they wanted to wait, like Raphael Bostic, who has now said he's open to cutting rates in September. In that case, it's probably going to be the August jobs report that we get at the beginning of next month that will make the decision for them of how much they cut. It does look like they are on track to cut.
That's Bloomberg's Mike McKee speaking there. Fed Chair Jerome Powell is due to speak about the economic outlook at the Central Bank Symposium in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, tomorrow. Democratic vice presidential nominee Tim Walz used his speech at the party's convention to appeal to swing state voters. Speaking in Chicago, Walz introduced himself to the nation as a teacher, coach and a veteran with bipartisan credentials. And leaning heavily into a message of freedom and service, he made a clear pitch to undecided voters.
That family down the road, they may not think like you do. They may not pray like you do. They may not love like you do. But they're your neighbors, and you look out for them, and they look out for you. Everybody belongs, and everybody has a responsibility to contribute. For me, it was serving in the Army National Guard. I joined up 2 days after my 17th birthday, and I proudly wore our nation's uniform for 24 years.
Walz's comments on his military service come as Republicans seize on the suggestion that the Minnesota governor overstated elements of his record while in the National Guard. Current Vice President Kamala Harris will close out the Democratic National Convention tonight as polls continue to show a tight race for the White House between her and former President Donald Trump. 4 bodies have been found by divers searching the wreckage of Mike Lynch's yacht. The UK tech entrepreneur and 5 others are missing, with authorities saying they were likely trapped and died inside the vessel off the coast of Sicily. Marine investigator James Wilkes says the 50-metre depth makes any diving very hard.
It's beyond scuba depth, so we understand that the divers have got a very limited amount of bottom time in which to work, something around 10 minutes. And if there are blocks to passageways, there are things getting in the way of the divers doing their job, then they're going to have to risk assess every single dive before they go down.
Marine investigator James Wilkes there. Italian prosecutors are investigating how the yacht, which was built to withstand hurricanes, sank within minutes. Norway's vast natural gas industry is about to start its annual repair season, right as prices see intense volatility. The country has grown to supply 30% of the continent's LNG, so the 3-week stop will see Europe go without the gas that would fuel a country the size of Italy or France. Some traders are bracing for a perfect storm where an escalation in the Middle East and Ukraine's incursion into Russia mean multiple other sources of gas disappear. And PwC's China unit is expected to be given a 6-month ban from operating in the country. Bloomberg has learned the decision is expected within weeks as part of a punishment over its audit of failed property giant Evergrande. If the penalty is handed down, it's expected to stop China PwC from signing off on financial results, restructurings and initial public offerings. More than 30 publicly listed mainland firms have dropped PwC as their auditor this year after scrutiny of its role at Evergrande. The company has declined to comment. Well, in a moment, we'll bring you more details on how some banks got early access to the US jobs data, plus why Nordic and Baltic countries are worried about the shadow fleet transporting Russian oil. But first, I've been reading the latest Top Shelf Society drinks newsletter from our colleagues, who this week are looking at a celebrity-backed whiskey, but not just any celebrity. It's Beyoncé's take on American rye. So she's partnered with LVMH on Sir Davis, named after her great-grandfather, and our reviewer Brad Jaffe is impressed. I didn't know this. Apparently Beyoncé loves high-end whiskey, so she had a very specific idea of how she wanted this one to taste, as a cross apparently between a Scotch and a Japanese single malt. So Brad is impressed, and he does, if you're interested, take a quick review of some other celebrity-endorsed drinks and how they didn't go down quite so well. You'll find the full piece on Bloomberg.com and on the terminal. Well, let's bring you more now in our top story, how at least 3 banks managed to obtain US payrolls data before the rest of Wall Street. Our Markets Live strategist Mary Nicola joins us now for more. Mary, great to have you with us. How significant is it that this data release appears to have gone to some firms first?
Yeah, it does create a bit of an uneven playing field and an unfair advantage, especially when you're talking about free and available data in a free market. So obviously we know that information is absolutely key and should be equally available to everyone. So but you know, as mentioned in the reports as well, it shouldn't come as a surprise given the series of recent mishaps that we saw, especially with the reporting of CPI data 30 minutes ahead of its release back in May. And then you also had the BLS answering inquiries from Wall Street firms the month before. Just shows a little bit leaning towards incompetence there.
What has the BLS said about this incident?
So it does look like they've apologized, and obviously because the integrity of the data releases and of course the impact that it can have on markets is absolutely critical, right? So that's going to be consistent in terms of how they try and figure this out. And of course, there's going to be a lot more pressure from Wall Street firms that this doesn't happen again. So they will have to step up their game a lot more.
So it was, in the end, a big revision in this number that had been so keenly awaited. What was the reaction on markets to it?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously there was a big revision and everyone's focused now on the labor market because that's going to be basically the straw that breaks the camel's back when it comes to the Fed cutting interest rates. So when you see such a downward revision, you realize that there are cracks within the labor market, and these cracks in the labor market are going to lead the Fed to start easing. And we already saw in the FOMC minutes that there was a bias with some of the members to cut in July. This just adds fuel to the fire that September becomes almost a guarantee.
Yeah, of course, those minutes had been very interesting to parse the detail of, because although there was a unanimous vote to hold at the last meeting, as you say, some doubts creeping in from some policymakers about whether they could have actually cut in July as well. Mary, this is all bringing us towards hearing from Jerome Powell at Jackson Hole. Bloomberg is going to be speaking to a range of FOMC policymakers over the next couple of days as well. What are sort of the key questions that we want to get answers from them on now?
Yeah, and it really will come down to the employment report and what the view is of the labor market. We always have to go back to what is the dual mandate of the Fed, and the dual mandate of the Fed is still both inflation and the labor market. Inflation is showing signs of easing, but it's the cracks in the labor market that is starting to worry a lot of some of the members of the FOMC, which we heard that they are concerned about the labor market. So it's it's a lot of what happens next and the size of the rate cuts and how aggressive the Fed is going to be will be dependent on the labor market report in the upcoming months. My guess would be, because there are still members within the FOMC who would like to take a more cautious approach and who are concerned about inflation, and they don't want to renege. Let's say they start cutting and then they have to pare back and hike again. I think what you start getting is a more cautious approach. So a 25 basis point cut in September rather than, a supersized cut in line with what the market was expecting.
How does that play out on markets? I mean, do they end up getting very disappointed if we only get 25 basis points, given the massive swings we've had in terms of bets on what the Fed's going to do in September?
Yeah, I mean, we've had these sways in the market before, and then the repricing as well. So we've moved from nearly 50 basis points of cuts to about 30 basis points of cuts in the market now for September. And really, it's about how aggressive the Fed goes thereafter, because the market is pricing in quite aggressive cuts over the next few months. And that's going to, again, be very dependent on what happens in the labor market and how things unfold there. But they will have, but remember, just much like what we're seeing in the rest of the G10 amongst G10 central banks, they're taking on a more cautious approach where they're saying we're going to cut first, and none of them really have, in terms of, let's say, the ECB, the BOE, inflation isn't in line with their target, but yet they've started cutting. And I think that's a lot of it is indicative of the fact that they don't need to have policy as restrictive as it was. But inflation is still a little bit sticky. Take, for example, in the UK, where services inflation is still high, and they're going to still be cautious in the US as well, in case, some pockets of inflation still remain a little bit sticky. So I think going forward, it really will depend on just how bad or how the labor market unfolds, and because we have to, the Fed really wants to ensure a soft landing.
Okay, Mary Nicola, our Markets Live macro strategist, thank you very much for joining us. Now, officials and environmental organisations in Nordic and Baltic countries are raising the alarm over a growing shadow fleet that's helping to transport Russian oil to global markets. Joining us now for more details, our Copenhagen reporter, Sanna Vass. Sanna, great to have you with us on the programme. Can you remind us, first of all, what the shadow fleet is and why has it got people worried?
Yeah, good morning. Well, the shadow fleet, it consists of hundreds of tankers that Russia has assembled in response to sanctions. And as you say, helps to keep Russia's oil flowing. So they're mostly oil vessels. They often have undeclared owners and questionable insurance. And then they sail under flags of countries with poor safety records. So it means that there are huge question marks around whether they meet safety standards and also whether anyone could be held accountable if an accident were to happen. So, of course, this has gotten people worried because, well, in part because the oil revenues help to fund Russia's war in Ukraine. But there's also this growing worry from officials and environmental organizations that the rise of the shadow fleet could at some point result in an accident and a potential oil spill because of the age and poor condition of these ships. And that's especially a big worry in the Baltic Sea, where every day these tankers move Russian oil through what is very shallow sea and one that's very vulnerable to human impact.
Yeah, you've been reporting about the concerns in Denmark and all of this. Why is Denmark such a key part of this story?
Yeah, Denmark, it's basically a transit point for when ships have loaded crude in Russia and they want to exit the Baltic Sea. They have to sail through these very narrow straits, which are Danish territorial waters. So some critics believe that Denmark should be doing more to block these tankers in transit, or at the very least demand that they have proper insurance. Denmark, on the other hand, has been quite clear that it won't do anything on its own. So back in the 19th century, they signed a treaty where the Danes committed to allow free passage through its waters, and this authorities say prevents them from intervening in any traffic going through. And even if theoretically Denmark could make demands on ships for environmental reasons, it would be practically impossible for it to enforce. And Denmark also risks triggering some form of retaliation from Russia. So there's really very little that the Danish government can do on its own.
Now, you've spoken to some of the people who've been on board these tankers. Who are they and what have they told you?
Yeah, and now I said there's very little Denmark can do on its own, but one thing that it is doing is to offer pilotage in transit. So Danish state pilots, they board these ships once they near the Danish waters, and they help navigate the ships through the straits. For this, for our latest feature, I spoke to several of these pilots. It's really quite a fascinating job, and they get a front row view of Moscow's floating oil economy nearly every day they go to work, and they paint a picture of poorly maintained vessels. Some struggle with outdated maps and very old equipment, and they also report filthy living conditions and crew that's often poorly trained. But what's even worse is that many of the Russian shadow fleet tankers, they refuse this pilotage. They don't have to accept it. So my sources, the pilots, they might not even have seen the worst of it. And the fact that many ships go through Denmark unassisted, that is increasingly worrying, because the route is very difficult for those unfamiliar with it. And of course, that's increasing the risk of an accident happening. We've already seen a collision happening earlier this year. So that is a major worry at the moment.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.